December 25th, 1991, 7:32 in the evening, Moscow time. A flag comes down over the Kremlin for the last time, and an empire that once controlled a sixth of the Earth's land simply stops existing. No invasion, no war, no enemy tanks in the streets. It collapsed from the inside, undone by 5 mistakes made decades before anyone noticed. This is how the Soviet Union actually fell, built in 1922, gone in 1991. This is the autopsy. In 1922, the USSR stitched together 11 time zones and over 100 nationalities under one flag, held together less by belief than by fear. From the outside, it looked unshakable. Underneath, the foundation was already cracking. Mistake number 1 starts with a number: quotas. Stalin's planners set production targets with no regard for quality or waste, or whether anyone actually needed what was made. Collectivized farms, run the same way, produced the opposite of what they promised: repeated, deadly shortages. By the 1970s, Soviet growth had quietly stalled, while Western economies kept pulling further and further ahead. Under Brezhnev, the country settled into stagnation, comfortable enough not to panic, broken enough not to recover. For a while, oil money hid the rot. The Kremlin leaned harder on petroleum revenue every year just to keep the lights on. Then in 1986, oil prices collapsed, and so did the illusion. Store shelves emptied. The ruble lost its value. Millions faced a poverty the state had sworn no longer existed. A command economy doesn't bend when the ground shifts under it. It just cracks. Rationing cards became a way of life for goods that used to be ordinary. And the gap between what the state promised and what it delivered kept getting harder to hide. By the late 80s, even loyal party members were quietly starting to doubt the math. Mistake number 2 began on Christmas Eve, 1979. Moscow expected a short, decisive campaign. It got a decade-long wound instead. Mujahideen fighters used the mountains the Red Army never fully controlled. Over 620,000 Soviet soldiers would serve here. None of them delivered the victory Moscow promised itself. Then the CIA started supplying Stinger missiles through Operation Cyclone, and the war changed overnight. Hundreds of Soviet helicopters went down, and with them, Moscow's biggest advantage. More than 14,000 Soviet soldiers never came home. Their coffins arrived quietly, almost in secret. Back home, morale didn't break all at once. It just kept leaking, year after year. Afghanistan became Moscow's Vietnam, a decade later, and no less costly. A war that drained the treasury exactly when the treasury could least afford it. Soldiers who did come home often came back changed, and the state had no real plan for that either. Afghanistan wasn't just a military failure. It was a crack in the myth of Soviet strength. 2 mistakes down, 3 to go. Mistake number 3 arrived in a single night. 1:23 a.m., April 26, 1986. Reactor number 4. It explodes, and radiation starts drifting across the continent. Soviet officials sat on the disaster for days while radiation quietly poisoned entire regions. Pripyat, home to 50,000 people, wasn't evacuated for 36 hours. Gorbachev himself later called it the moment Soviet confidence broke for good, because Chernobyl didn't just poison land. It exposed a system built on decades of lies, and a population that was starting to notice. A child's toy left behind, a classroom frozen in time, the cost of a cover-up, permanent. Firefighters and plant workers were sent in with almost no protection, and no honest warning of the cost. Chernobyl is still, in some sense, an open wound on the map. 3 mistakes down. The cracks are no longer hairline. Mistake number 4 was an attempt to fix everything before it. Gorbachev's glasnost opened Soviet media in ways the country had never experienced. But the truth that came pouring out didn't strengthen the party. It gutted it. Suddenly, people were reading about Stalin's purges, the gulags, decades of buried history, all at once. Perestroika was supposed to modernize a failing economy. Instead, it accelerated the collapse. By 1990, stagnation had become an outright crisis. There was no walking it back. Gorbachev would later admit he never grasped how deep the rot actually went. Openness was supposed to save the system. Instead, it gave millions the words to finally say it was broken. Every truth that came out made the next one harder to contain. 4 mistakes down, 1 left. The biggest one. Mistake number 5 was a unity Moscow could no longer force. Across all 15 republics, identities suppressed for decades exploded into open independence movements. In the Baltics, nearly 2 million people joined hands in a human chain 675 miles long, Estonia to Latvia to Lithuania. The world watched in stunned silence. In January 1991, Soviet troops opened fire on unarmed civilians in Vilnius. 14 Lithuanian defenders killed. It backfired instantly. Baltic resistance hardened. World opinion turned decisively against Moscow. The Soviet military was still one of the largest on Earth, and it couldn't shoot its way out of a political crisis. Then came the moment that broke what was left. August 18, 1991. Hardliners placed Gorbachev under house arrest, an attempt to seize control before the Union could unravel any further. They took the television stations. They couldn't take Yeltsin's defiance. Muscovites formed human chains around the parliament, daring the army to fire on their own people. Key military units simply refused to advance. For 3 days, nobody knew which way it would break. Then, all at once, the plotters' nerve gave out before the people's did. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed, and whatever authority the party had left went down with it. One by one, the republics rushed to declare independence. 15 in total. In December, Ukraine voted for independence, over 90% in favor. Without Ukraine, the Soviet breadbasket and its second largest republic, there was no union left to save. On December 8th, in a hunting lodge in Belarus, 3 leaders signed the agreement that ended the Soviet state. Gorbachev later called it a surprise. By then, he had no power left to stop it. 17 days later, he resigned on live television, defending reforms the country no longer existed to receive. At 7:32 that evening, the Soviet flag came down. The Russian tricolour rose in its place. 74 years of Soviet history ended that night. Not just a government, an entire idea. Millions of people went to bed in one country and woke up in another without ever leaving home. None of these 5 mistakes happened alone. Each one fed the next. Economic failure demanded reform. Reform cracked the system open and let nationalism pour through the gaps. Afghanistan drained the treasury the same year the oil crash stripped away its last cushion. Chernobyl discredited the state's word right as Glasnost gave people the language to say so. And a costly arms race with the West quietly convinced Soviet leadership they were losing a war they couldn't afford. Historians largely agree the collapse was inevitable. What still surprises people is how fast it actually happened. 15 new nations rose from the wreckage, each left to rebuild almost from nothing. Russia walked out of the ruins of its own empire and spent the next decades figuring out who it was without one. The lesson the Soviet Union left behind was a simple one. An empire held together by force alone will eventually meet a moment force can't survive. 5 mistakes brought down the Soviet Union. That's the story everyone tells. But 5 was never the whole list. It was just the 5 that happened last. Underneath those 5, there were 5 more. Quieter failures, decades older, that made the last 5 inevitable. This is the second half of the autopsy. 10 mistakes. 1 collapse. Let's finish the list. Mistake number 6 starts with the people who were supposed to believe in it most. By the 1970s, the people running the Soviet Union had quietly stopped believing in it. They were called the nomenklatura, a class of officials with special stores, private clinics, and country dachas. While preaching equality to everyone else, it wasn't hidden exactly. It just wasn't discussed. An entire generation of administrators learned to recite ideology without believing a word of it. Corruption became just another line item, bribes for apartments, promotions, and exit visas. When the system's own caretakers stop believing in it, it doesn't need an enemy to bring it down. It just needs time. That hollowing out didn't happen overnight. It happened in plain sight for decades, and nobody with power had a reason to stop it. Mistake number 6. A ruling class that quietly gave up on its own religion. Mistake number 7 was a leadership crisis the whole world could see. In November 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died after 18 years in power. The last third of it spent visibly declining. His successor, Yuri Andropov, lasted 15 months before he died too. Then Konstantin Chernenko took over and lasted barely 13. 3 state funerals in under 3 years. Soviet citizens started joking about it darkly. Western newspapers ran the same joke. How do you tell the Soviet leader is dead? His car stops at the red light. A superpower that couldn't keep a leader alive long enough to finish a term wasn't projecting strength. It was projecting decay. By the time Gorbachev finally took power in 1985, the world had stopped expecting the Soviet system to fix itself. Mistake number 7. A gerontocracy that ran out of leaders before it ran out of problems. Mistake number 8 happened not inside the USSR, but around it. For over 40 years, Moscow had crushed uprisings in its satellite states without hesitation. Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968. The message was always the same: leave the bloc and tanks will answer. But by 1989, Gorbachev made a decision that changed everything. He quietly let it be known. This time, there would be no tanks. Poland held elections. Solidarity won. Moscow did nothing. Hungary opened its border to Austria. Thousands of East Germans simply walked through it. Then, on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall itself came down. Within weeks, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria followed. The entire Eastern Bloc unraveled in a single season. Moscow's satellite empire, the buffer it had built at the cost of millions of lives, dissolved in about 90 days. If the USSR couldn't hold on to Eastern Europe without tanks, it was only a matter of time before the same question got asked at home. Mistake number 8. Losing the empire abroad taught everyone watching that the one at home could fall too. Mistake number 9 was a competition the USSR could no longer afford to enter. For decades, the arms race with the United States had already been consuming a staggering share of the Soviet economy. Then, in 1983, President Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile shield. The press called it Star Wars. Soviet planners didn't find it funny. Whether or not the technology would actually work almost didn't matter. Moscow believed it might, and that belief alone forced them to try to match it. By the mid-1980s, the military was consuming close to a quarter of Soviet GDP. Money that didn't go to shelves, or housing, or the ordinary life the state kept promising was coming. The Soviet Union wasn't outfought. It was outspent into exhaustion by a race it was too proud to quit. Mistake number 9. Trying to win a competition the economy had already quietly lost. Mistake number 10 was quieter than a war and more expensive than anyone admitted. For decades, Moscow bankrolled revolutionary movements and client states across the globe. Cuba alone received billions of dollars in annual subsidies just to keep it afloat. Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Vietnam. Each one a promise of solidarity, each one a bill Moscow kept paying. None of these commitments were reversible without losing face on the world stage. So the spending continued, year after year, even as bread lines grew longer back home. An empire had to look strong everywhere at once, even while it was quietly running out of everything at home. Mistake number 10. A superpower spread thin enough to eventually snap at its weakest point, its own economy. 10 mistakes, not 5. Each one built on the last, for over half a century. A ruling class that stopped believing. A leadership that couldn't stay alive. An empire abroad that folded in a season. A weapons race too expensive to win, and a world of client states too costly to keep. Layer all 10 together, and the 5 sudden mistakes of 1991 don't look sudden anymore. They look like the final push on a wall that had been leaning for 50 years. Every empire tells itself its cracks are manageable, right up until they aren't. The Soviet Union didn't fall in 1991. It fell for 50 years and finally hit the ground in 1991. 10 mistakes, 1 collapse. And a lesson every empire since has had the chance to learn, and mostly.